There's a ledger that determines whether entire nations thrive or collapse, whether your savings evaporate overnight or compound into generational wealth. And here's what nobody tells you. You can't see it, you can't audit it, and the people who control it have more power than most governments. This isn't conspiracy, it's monetary history. And once you understand how this ledger works, you'll never look at money the same way again. The question isn't whether this system affects you, it's whether you'll understand it before it's too late. Before 1971, money meant something tangible. Every dollar bill was a claim check, a promise that somewhere in a vault there was gold with your name on it. The ledger was simple. Gold reserves on one side, currency in circulation on the other. The books had to balance. But here's where it gets interesting. That system died on August 15, 1971, when President Nixon made an announcement that would reshape global economics forever. He closed the gold window. No more conversions. No more balance sheet. And suddenly, the ledger became abstract. What replaced it wasn't chaos, though. It was something far more sophisticated. A new kind of ledger emerged, one based not on physical assets, but on debt, credit, and a promise that would stretch across generations. This ledger would determine which countries became economic superpowers and which ones descended into hyperinflation, which citizens became wealthy and which ones worked harder every year just to stay in place. But to understand how we got here, we need to go back further, much further. So the story begins in 1694 with the founding of the Bank of England. For the first time in history, a private institution was given the power to create money out of thin air, but only as loans. Here's the twist. When the bank created £10 and lent it out, it demanded £11 back. That extra pound of interest had to come from somewhere, but where? The answer: more loans, more money creation, an ever-expanding cycle.
Ow.
This was the original invisible ledger. On one side, assets the loans banks made. On the other side, liabilities the deposits they owed. And in the middle, a mathematical impossibility that would drive economic expansion for centuries. The system required perpetual growth because the interest owed always exceeded the money in existence. Fast forward to 1913. The United States creates its own central bank, the Federal Reserve. The ledger grows more complex. Now, commercial banks could create money through fractional reserve lending, keeping only a fraction of deposits in reserve and lending out the rest. Money multiplied through accounting entries. $10 in deposits could become $90 in loans, all recorded in ledgers as if they were equivalent. But this system had a constraint: gold. As long as currencies were backed by gold reserves, there was a ceiling on how much the ledger could expand. That constraint created discipline. It also created limitations. In 1944, world leaders gathered at Bretton Woods to redesign the global monetary system. The dollar would become the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Other currencies would peg to the dollar. The invisible ledger now had a global hierarchy with America's ledger at the top. This arrangement gave the United States an extraordinary privilege. While other nations had to earn dollars through exports, America could simply print them. The ledger expanded rapidly. The U.S. financed the Marshall Plan, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Great Society programs, all while running persistent trade deficits. But here's the problem. The physical gold reserves weren't growing. By the late 1960s, foreign central banks held more dollar claims than the U.S. had gold to cover them. The ledger had diverged from reality. Something had to give. August 15, 1971, President Nixon appears on television and announces that the United States will no longer convert dollars to gold. Temporarily, he says. 50 years later, that temporary measure remains in effect. What happened next changed everything. The ledger was no longer constrained by physical reality. It became purely abstract, a digital record of credits and debits with no anchor to the material world. Money was now nothing more than accounting entries backed by government decree and collective belief. This unleashed an era of unprecedented expansion. Without gold convertibility, central banks could expand their balance sheets at will. National debts exploded. Credit markets ballooned. The invisible ledger grew exponentially, recording liabilities that could never actually be paid off, only rolled over, refinanced, and expanded further. The consequences revealed themselves slowly, then suddenly. Countries that understood the new rules that accumulated dollar reserves, managed their exchange rates strategically, and borrowed wisely prospered. Japan, Germany, China, Those that didn't faced currency crises, hyperinflation, and economic collapse. Argentina, Venezuela, Zimbabwe. But even within winning countries, the ledger created stark divisions. Those who owned assets, real estate, stocks, businesses, saw their wealth multiply as central banks expanded the money supply. Those who relied on wages saw their purchasing power erode. The ledger recorded rising asset prices as wealth creation, but for many it felt like falling behind. Between 1971 and 2023, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet grew from $80 billion to $9 trillion. Other central banks followed similar trajectories. Every entry on those balance sheets represented money created not through production, but through accounting. Every expansion of the ledger meant someone gained and someone lost. The pattern repeated globally. 2008 financial crisis ledger expansion through bank bailouts. 2020 pandemic ledger expansion through stimulus. Each crisis, each solution, expanded the invisible ledger further, redistributing wealth through monetary policy rather than market forces. Today, the ledger is more powerful than ever. Global debt exceeds $300 trillion, roughly 350% of world GDP. Central bank balance sheets hold assets worth tens of trillions. And here's the shocking part. Most of this money exists only as digital entries, created through keyboard strokes, with no corresponding increase in goods or services. The same patterns emerge across economies. Asset price inflation that benefits those who already own assets. Wage stagnation for those who don't. Currency devaluation that punishes savers. And perpetual refinancing that prevents any actual debt repayment. Look at housing markets. In cities from San Francisco to Sydney, home prices have decoupled from incomes not because of supply constraints alone, but because expanded money supply flows into assets, the ledger grows, asset owners win. Recent data shows the top 10% now own 67% of all wealth in the U.S., up from 61% in 1989. That gap widens every time the ledger expands. This is the secret. Monetary expansion isn't neutral. It's a redistribution mechanism, favoring those closest to money creation banks. Governments, large corporations, asset holders at the expense of those furthest away. So what does this mean for you? First, understand that money is accounting, not wealth. The ledger can expand infinitely, but real resources cannot. When the ledger grows faster than the economy, purchasing power shifts from currency holders to asset holders. Second, the system is designed for perpetual expansion. Central banks cannot allow the ledger to contract significantly without triggering financial crisis. This means continued monetary expansion is not a possibility, it's a structural requirement. Third, your economic fate depends on which side of the ledger you're on. Are you holding currency that can be inflated away, or assets that appreciate as the ledger expands? This isn't investment advice, it's pattern recognition. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The invisible ledger will continue growing because the alternative debt deflation and systemic collapse is politically unacceptable. The question isn't whether expansion continues, but who benefits and who pays the cost. The next time you hear about central bank policy, stimulus programs, or quantitative easing, remember, you're hearing about entries in the invisible ledger. Entries that determine who wins and who loses, who builds wealth and who falls behind. If you found this valuable, subscribe for more deep dives into the systems that shape our economic reality. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Do you think this system is sustainable, or are we approaching a reckoning? The ledger keeps expanding. The question is, are you ready?